Why has it got so hard to get hold of these, the keys to your first home? And how does this, a box of eggs, help show us how the housing market got so crazy?
Way too expensive for me to move out.
There's no world where it's normal to be 26 years old still living at home.
Would never ever be able to afford a house like this on my own.
I'm Dharshini David, I'm the BBC's Deputy Economics Editor, and I've been delving into this problem. Actually, it has become slightly easier in the last few years. However, why is it still so much harder for today's first-time buyers to get onto the property ladder than it was for their parents? Because you're not imagining it. Just take a look at this chart. If you were born in the mid-90s, you've got about a 25% chance of owning your own home, and nearly 4 in 10 of you are relying on financial help from your families to do it. That's far lower than in the 1990s, when 20-somethings had a nearly 50% chance of owning their home. They were almost twice as likely to be on the housing ladder. And unsurprisingly, the people who can buy their first home tend to be better off. Nearly 2/3 of first-time buyers were earning more than £50,000 a year. So before we get onto the current picture, let's just take a step back and consider what's behind that long-term shift in trends. No surprises, it's about the level of property prices. Those have outpaced incomes for decades. In 1997, average house prices were 3.6 times average household incomes in England and Wales. But today, it's 7.6 times. So what do these eggs have to do with it? Well, if the price of eggs had risen at the same rate as the price of houses since 1955, they'd cost over £32 for a box of 12. To be fair, affordability was even worse in Victorian times. More on that later. But today's first-time buyers do have a right to feel hard done by. So why have property prices soared? Well, changes in the mortgage market have played a part, but ultimately it boils down to this. We're not building enough homes. Bricks and mortar, houses and flats. We've got more than 28 million dwellings in the UK, but we're simply not adding enough. That's despite all the promises down the years from various politicians that they do more.
We need a national crusade to get homes built.
It's time to build 1.5 million new homes across the country.
The government previously estimated that we'd need an additional 300,000 homes per year just in England to keep up with population change and the way we're choosing to live in smaller households. And about half of those should be affordable homes. But the number of new dwellings isn't keeping pace. Only 208,000 were built in the last year, and it was parts of London and the southeast in particular which failed to keep up, where shortages are already most acute. In fact, we've not built close to 300,000 new homes in a year for well over 2 decades. So why aren't we building enough homes? Well, there are many reasons, but let's just focus in on 2 key ones. Inflation, everyone's bugbear, and then, of course, there's planning. First, inflation. From the price of bricks and land to builders' wages, there are many costs to consider. The cost of raw materials, timber, steel, plasterboard, concrete and insulation rose in line with general inflation from the 1990s until the pandemic, when they became harder to source, which pushed up prices. That was compounded by the impact of the war in Ukraine, which drove up both the cost of energy, 15% in a single year, for making those items and for use in construction itself. So, inflation of construction materials has soared, and the war in Iran has just added to that. If you're a developer, add in the costs of skill shortages exacerbated by Brexit, and the cost of building homes has become far more expensive than it was just a few years ago. So, as a guide, a home that cost £150,000 to build in 2015 may be more like £230,000 now. And about half of that increase comes from higher labour and material costs. And higher inflation tends to mean higher interest rates, so the cost of financing projects rises too. Analysts say total building costs could rise by a further 15% in the next 5 years. So where does this leave developers? Well, I've been speaking to Hannah Aldridge. She's a housing expert at the Resolution Foundation, a think tank which focuses on the plight of lower and middle income households.
Viability is the kind of industry term, which is essentially, can you build a home at a price that allows people to buy it, but also allows you to make a sufficient profit that you're going to keep building. At the moment, they're not really able to secure those levels of profits, and those profits are coming down. So that's kind of making them kind of rethink how they need to operate, because will they be able to build and get those returns?
It's a careful balancing act for them. Build too many homes at a time when costs are rising and demand uncertain, and you risk eating into your profits or even making a loss. So, planning. Some might call it red tape, but the government says the rules are important to ensure that buildings serve communities and the economy, to protect the environment and uphold safety standards. But more stringent regulation does tend to mean higher costs. And planning has traditionally been overseen by local authorities. Many have complained the process is too slow and chaotic. Keir Starmer's government introduced plans to streamline the process, but those will take years to deliver. Building on some of the green belt, which some housing economists believe will ease the problems, is also very difficult and controversial. So, inflation and planning are two key reasons why we're not building enough homes. But there's another factor which makes it really difficult to get on to the housing ladder, and that's the deposit hurdle. Without enough of the right types of new homes, prices have risen, meaning that you will have to find thousands of pounds to put together a deposit. Look at how much you need to save just to get a 10% deposit in different areas of the country, and it's particularly expensive in London. So how easy is it to save up? Well, remember all those sneering remarks about millennials being able to afford a home if they just gave up avocado on toast? Well, if that were true and you had a daily habit eating out, we reckon it would take you over 5.5 years to save for a deposit in Birmingham and over 12 years in London. It's particularly hard if you're having to pay rent too. Those typically soak up a third of prospective buyers' incomes. No surprise, a larger number of young people are opting to live at home with much lower housing costs, leaving them able to save a lot more.
We sort of used to talk a lot about the bank of mum and dad, where people were getting money from their parents in order to get a deposit, but now people are talking about the hotel of mum and dad. And that can be a really positive decision for someone. It allows them to save, but it can be quite preventative, because it means that they're not able to kind of enjoy their 20s in the way that they might have imagined that they could, but also they might not be able to kind of take job opportunities because they're sort of living in their parents' home, which is perhaps quite hard to get to different workplaces. So it kind of has a lot of trade-offs.
Here's the glimmer of hope. Remember how I told you where house prices were around about 7 times average income in England and Wales? Believe it or not, that's actually come down, and it's the best it's been in a decade, because back in 2021, house prices were nearly 9 times average earnings. House prices have typically risen more slowly than wages over the past few years, making it easier to save up for a deposit, particularly as some lenders now only want 5% rather than 10%. And once you're in that position, well, mortgages have become easier to come by. Some lenders are prepared to give out more money, others perhaps to lend out money for longer terms. And look at this. The slower growth of prices and lower interest rates in recent years means mortgage payments relative to wages are moving back down towards the long-term average. So it's still harder than in previous generations. So what's the solution? Back to the Victorians. Between 1850 and 1915, Britain's housing stock more than doubled, making homes more affordable. Why? Well, it was a perfect storm. The abolition of a tax on bricks and windows brought down costs, there was access to easy finance, and a public health bill put a new emphasis on urban planning. Plus, land was cheap. Whatever approach the government takes, it will take time to deliver. It'll take years to crack this. Something you're not going to want to hear when you're itching to get your hands on these, the keys to your own front door.